The next speaker, Mr. Professor, I should say Professor Glenn Diesen, is a good friend. He has actually been a speaker in the previous webinars. He happens to be a scholar in a type of economic thinking that historically has been virtually buried or uh, 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 has disappeared from all of the educational institutions, which has to do with the issue of physical economy and what is called the American system of political economy. He has done his own independent research on that, and he will make a presentation today, which I think is a framework and a foundation for how we can actually bring the European economies and Western economies back into a collaborative effort with China that will massively increase the success and development for humanity as a whole. So this has historical relevance, but it is very relevant for a solution in many of the overriding problems that are facing European and Western, including the United States, economies right now today. I just mentioned the United States today is not operating off of the American system concepts, but we would hope that this could be changed and would be a great step towards solving many of the problems that we are facing. So, Professor Diesen, you are welcome to have the floor now.
Thank you very much. And well, yeah, that's actually my topic today. It's the rise of China, because there tends to be, well, at least here in the West, growing hostility, at least among the political class, but this is often linked to the loss of hegemony. But my argument is that this new spread, the new international distribution of power, will actually be more beneficial, not just for us, but also the world eventually. And because we can even go back these days, of course, liberalism has become more of an ideology, and we tend to forget that it was meant to be one tool in the box, not the silver bullet to everything. Even Adam Smith, you know, he wrote once that the discovery of America and the passage to the East Indies were the two greatest discoveries in history, simply because it connected the world. However, he did also recognize that it resulted in what he referred to as dreadful misfortune for the natives who met the Europeans. And the reason why was the uneven distribution of power, the hegemonic format, which led to a very exploitationist and imperial format for how the West interacted with the world, one which would also undermine our own economies eventually. So what he argued was that a more equal distribution of wealth in the rest of the world would result in much more fair and peaceful world. And so he hoped that in the future you would see other parts of the world rising, or even if the Europeans would be somewhat weaker, if you had more of an equilibrium, you could have a economy where trade and economic interdependence actually created more peace and cooperation instead of this exploitation. So one has to ask why there's so much hostility towards the rise of China, because obviously it's much of the world has been risen out of poverty. You see these infrastructure projects being expanded across the world, and of course when China travels around the world, it's very much welcomed. As is always pointed out, it comes with cooperation and not to give lectures. So I think the main argument we always have against China is, you know, they're breaking with economic liberalism by financing strategic industries and all of this. But I would point out that no major power in the world has risen either to greatness on pure market capitalism and free market, that is, and also that some intervention in the market has always been advocated as something positive. So, for example, one of the things which Stephen Brower pointed out has been buried in history is the idea that how, for example, Britain rose to power. The British, they rose not on economic liberalism alone. They actually had a very vigorous industrial policy with government subsidies. They tried to they ensured to control the seas, and also they then had the establishment of the dominant currency and the main banks. And once they had this position of dominance, this is when they embraced, of course, they repealed the Corn Laws and promoted economic liberalism, not as a format solely of cooperation, but one of cementing the hegemony. And this was very much clear in the debates they had around the Corn Laws. This was Britain would produce for the world, and the rest of the world could do the agricultural work. And again, this did not set up the economic system as Smith would have suggested to be based on cooperation. And again, there's a famous quote by Frederick List in 1841 where he explains that this was a very clever device, that anyone who has attained greatness, he will kick away the ladder he has climbed up on in order to deprive others of the means of climbing up after him. And this was to a large extent what the American system was based on as well, as List worked with Alexander Hamilton, and well, at least on these ideas. And the whole idea was, if you had always, the reason why a hegemon will always then insist on having no intervention in market, even though it does it itself, is because mature industries will always be able to outcompete infant industries. The mature industries are obviously high quality, low cost, and it's very hard for other countries to rise in this world if they are infant industries. So by definition, they're low quality and high cost. So what the American system set out to do was, of course, with using temporary subsidies and tariffs in order to develop industrial capability. And this is simply because industrial sovereignty was linked to political sovereignty. As countries who become excessively reliant on only one other actor, you will see them diminished, and often they can have their political sovereignty undermined. So for that reason, I argue that the American system consisted of three pillars. They had the manufacturing base, physical connectivity with transportation corridors. On third was financial, so its own national bank. And it was through this which they were able to have a more just relationship. They did not succumb to British dominance anymore. They were able to cement their political sovereignty, and other countries began to copy this system. The French and the Germans, they followed to a large extent these three pillars in terms of developing their own industries, developing their own transportation corridors, and more sovereign control over banking. Even Japan went down this path where he had people like Patient Smith, who was a big advocate of the American system, who went to work as an advisor for the Japanese emperor in the 1870s. For a large part of the motivation of Japan was, of course, they had seen what happened to China in the Great Opium Wars, in which they were destroyed by the British. And this also demonstrated the need to have your own sovereign control over your industries, also not to lose control over key transportation corridors or maritime corridors to the British, and also the financial aspect. So what can be used as a currency, for example. And well, long story short, the Russians also followed this system towards the end of the 19th century with their foreign minister, Sergei Witte, who then explicitly handed out pamphlets with Hamilton and the List's idea. And they then also began to industrialize very fast. They developed their railroads from Europe to Asia, and of course began to establish greater financial autonomy, thus becoming the fastest growing power in the late 19th century. So there's a long history behind this. Now I often try to put what China has done in the context of this, what all other countries have done when they rise to greatness. And as we see with China, what have they done? Well, now they're challenging to a large extent the American position, because what the Americans used to develop independence from the British, they've since used to develop dominance, that is to control the main industries in the world, to control all the maritime transportation corridors, to dominate the only currencies, only trade currency, only reserve currency. Now, for China, they've to some extent followed a similar model, but with some crucial differences. So again, this three-pillar system. China has a very vigorous industrial policy, especially then with the China 2025 and taking a leadership role, I would say, in many of our key strategic industries. On the Belt and Road Initiative, also developing much physical corridors, but unlike, I would say, I think it's important that they keep referring to it as the new Silk Road, because what the Europeans did with the maritime corridors from the early 16th century was to establish a dominant position in the world. That is to have sole control over key maritime highways. Now, what we see with China is they haven't actually pursued a hegemonic position in this way. And you see this with competing corridors for physical connectivity. They don't oppose it, indeed, from the cooperation with other states, but also the more, not ideology, but the more ideas of a multipolar world. They're actually embracing it. As they keep saying with this global civilization initiative, there can't only be one center of power, can't only be one civilization, there has to be several. So while the Chinese have been developing this Belt and Road Initiative with greater physical connectivity, I think it demonstrates that it's a form of pushing for a multipolar system with several centers of power without seeking to control any of them. And the same goes for the development banks and trade in national currencies, new payment systems. We see that this becomes anti-hegemonic. It's not even anti-American, which we keep being told, because it's not undermining one country, it's undermining a hegemonic system only. So I think what we're seeing is simply not just another power rising like the former, but indeed it's emergence of a new international system for economic cooperation. And this is where I think in the West we go all wrong, because we tend to see this as a winner takes all approach, in which the winner will effectively be the next hegemon. But there's very little that indicates that China is actually aiming for hegemony. And which is why I'm also a big advocate for why Norway and Europe should seek greater cooperation with China, simply to be able to diversify our economic partnerships as well, and not fall back into this hegemonic system where we become excessively reliant only on the United States. And lastly, I would just like to say, this can also be a good corrective measure for the West, because well, again, I think we should welcome this new China model, because we used to have a similar system under industrial capitalism. That is, while we still had a physical economy. Keep in mind that even economic liberals, be it Adam Smith or John Stuart Mill, David Ricardo, they all recognized the danger of economic power concentrating over time. And this is why Smith recognized that free market efficiency, yes, it produces maximized efficiency. However, there will always be need to reform that. And this is why formulating economic liberalism as a hegemonic policy has been so dangerous, because one of the key concerns now for the Americans when they look at China is simply that they can't compete anymore. But part of the reasons why they can't compete is not really the Chinese fault. This is something even economic liberals recognized for decades, was that they were concerned about rent seekers who did not participate in the production process. You know, this results in less competitive industries and the emergence of oligarchs. And so a key argument in the 19th century was we needed to tax rent seekers, and the income could be used to finance infrastructure, fund education, other activities which would elevate both the standard of living as well as improve economic competitiveness. Now, this sounds very alien for anyone who thinks of economic liberalism today, which is effectively cheering on the rent seekers and this concentration of wealth. So my point is simply that I think in the West there's a huge need now for some great reforms in our economies, and towards this end, I think we should be looking more towards China, not just as a partner, but also recognizing how our economic model isn't functioning anymore, and one of the reasons is we linked this liberal economic system to a hegemonic system, which allowed a lot of rot to set in. Yes, anyways, I think I went a bit over time, so I'll thank you.